Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lum.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, welcome back. Another episode of the Cardiff Met Sport Coaching Hub podcast. The final episode of Season 5, and we're joined again by Professor Robyn Jones. We'll do a reintroduction in just a moment, but I do think it's probably worth starting the episode with a confession, which is that this is take 2 of this particular episode, because we recorded it a couple of weeks ago. We got to the end and we sort of thought, that wasn't quite right. We need to maybe revisit what we wanted to get out of the episode, and it just felt like we could perhaps do it a little bit more justice. Isn't that right, boys?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we really want to do is talk about one of your papers, Robyn, from quite a few years ago now, from 2007, Coaching Redefined, an Everyday Pedagogical Endeavour. And rather than, I guess, our take 1, which was your classic interview style like we normally do, we were hoping that today could be a bit more of a reading group type episode. So Manuel's come from, I guess, the other side of the studio and joined us today as well to add his insight too. And hopefully we can just have a discussion around the paper and what it means for us in 2025, quite a few years on from publication, in terms of our practice and also our views on research.
Yeah, absolutely. We, speaking yesterday and getting ready for the episode, we were talking about the fact that, this is a paper that we've all read before, but we're 15, 16 years on now, and revisiting the paper, it sort of, it evokes, certain experiences and feelings, emotions, thoughts, etc., that are perhaps different now compared to when we first read them. And really the aim of the episode is to kind of break those down in a bit of detail, maybe just examine some of the distance travelled since, Robyn, you wrote this paper, or perhaps even not travelled in some cases as well. So, so that's very much the aim of today. Now, I think probably we'll go to a reintroduction of the man himself. So, Robyn, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for that illuminating introduction. I'm Robyn Jones. I'm a professor of sport and social theory here at Cardiff Met. Been here for 20 years, actually, which seems like a long time, but it has gone really quickly. But this specific writing, it actually started when I was in, I think, at the University of Bath, and I kind of finished it when I was at Cardiff. So it really kind of spans the 2 decades ever since I've been here.
I think it is worth us just giving a little bit of a history of the paper before we sort of dip into what we've all taken from it and reading it again. Where was the inspiration for the paper, and what was the idea behind the format as well? Because the format's quite novel in that it's a conversation between coaching scientists and educational researcher. What was the sort of the intention behind that?
I think, as with most of really of the writings in the early days, and I still regard those as the early days, was born from a kind of frustration by being an outsider to the mainstream, which it's easier then to be a little bit more radical, I think. Just on reflection, it was quite an easy one to actually write. And I think one of the reasons why is because it wasn't wedded to a particular format, a traditional format of an introduction, in which you have a significance and therefore, some methodology, like et cetera, et cetera. So in that regard, and I must say that, so I'm not the author of the format either. Like, I actually saw it used elsewhere, and I thought it was an interesting way to actually engage readers, which is something I'd like to perhaps explore like a little bit more later.
I think that that again is part of the premise of us having another crack at this episode, is that I think, we would have, or perhaps you would have liked this to have been slightly more widely read, or to be revisited perhaps more recently, because the messages that are coming through it are probably still very relevant to some of the challenges that we're facing, or some of the positions we find ourselves in at the minute as coaching scholars.
Well, I think when I wrote it, Mike, it was, as I said before, it's very much, perhaps I can view myself very much as an outsider, and so it's easier to write a bit more so radically. And the field has evolved enormously, I think, really ever since I wrote the paper. It's evolved in all sorts of ways, but still, when you go back and actually sort of read and deduce some of the main messages in there, you can see that in some ways that it hasn't evolved very much, that there's still an adherence to some kind of rationality really within the writings of academics regarding, if you can do this, that, and the other, then you can be a coach too, you can be successful too. Without really thinking, well, what are you trying to do here? And of course, the main message within the article was, it's an educational relationship. That's what the essence really of the job is, of being a coach. It's aimed at the other's learning, and that is still kind of somehow not adequately addressed in a lot of the writings, I think.
Is the critique still relevant today then? Is that what you're saying?
Less so, but yes. I still see writings that are quite kind of decontextualized, that are perhaps not really engaged with the essence of the job of being a coach, which is the other's learning. You can't just set up a session and assume learning happens, like in many ways. There has to be an intention here. And this is one of the early efforts to actually think about, well, as I said, what are we trying to do here? It's really to get at the essence of that, as opposed to something akin to applied sports science, which you still see really written.
Can I ask one more thing then? I'm on this side now today, so I'll just take this opportunity to ask as many questions as I can. You said that you felt like an outsider.
Yeah.
Do you still feel like one, considering that the critique is still relevant, or are you an outsider with a bigger following, if following is the right word?
Oh, I think less so as such. But as I said, there seems to be kind of still, I guess the argument has to be made in a better way. There's still a lack of agreement and consensus about what the discipline really is about and how that should inform and practice. And so the argument inherent within this article, I think, still has to be made, maybe revisited and maybe remade, simply because that the evidence exists that this is what it's about, as opposed to, as I said before, it is not really just applied sports science, just using other elements of sports science, within an environment where you're trying to educate others. It's a lot more than that.
When you say outsider, was it that you felt outsider sort of in relation to, the loud voice, the majority, the masses of sport coaching, or more specifically how, certain structures, governing bodies, for example, were, how much they were buying into or favouring a particular form of knowledge?
Yes. We didn't have a journal. We didn't have like a de facto organization, if you like. So the academic subject as a discipline really wasn't very well established, and where it was, as I said, it was akin to having a module, maybe kind of psychology for coaches. physiology for coaches, biomechanics for coaches. Rarely was anything linked to kind of sociology in there, and the object. One of the main objectives of kind of sociology is trying to untangle really the debates in between agency and structure, which is a lot to do with when you're actually kind of setting up a session. How much kind of structure and aimed at what, and how much agency would you allow athletes? This thing about having some roots and wings, which goes to really some learning, is what you're trying to do with students.
Speaking of sociology, and obviously you've mentioned education and of course pedagogy coming into that, you present them in the paper as two key areas of knowledge that coaches or coaching scholars can really build upon and develop from. Despite that, we've had kind of recent conversations around these two areas being developed along parallel but quite separate lines. Why do you think that is?
Really know, Ollie. Maybe it's because as academics, I think we set ourselves up, and then we kind of follow certain lines of inquiry. We don't think about kind of synthesizing really with others. I think, as I've said before, where I should have started all those years ago was something akin to maybe kind of phenomenology, which is really looking at the actual kind of phenomenon of what is happening here. And maybe if it had started there, and branched out from there, we'd have seen that the educational and the social are really wrapped around each other here. And maybe that they wouldn't have just worked along kind of separate lines. I'm not sure that they're explicitly on kind of separate lines within the writings anyway, but it's because there's an implicit, maybe assumption within the writings that, of course, influence, is vital. So when you set up a session, of course, who is the coach really matters. It's just that they're not explored in that way, in that joint way. And so that's the missing bit. I think it's just making it obvious.
Is that where those original theories become, where they've been enabling for the past 2 decades? Is that where they become quite limiting the more we explore them, that the original theory, so take Goffman, for example, that you've used a lot, is separate from education in many ways? Is the fact that we've drawn upon those theories now limiting us as coaching scholars?
I think in some ways, yes. I think in some ways, I guess the reason why Goffman was so influential was because his writings, I could relate to them. That I had to give a performance here as a coach. I had to give something, like a stand up. It was a performance. It's undoubtedly. I didn't behave that way all the time when I coached. But what was missing as such, and what was ignored, was that it was a performance aimed at something. And although we went at its performance aimed at getting respect, there has to be another step. It wasn't just about respect. It was in order that you influence the learning of others. And that extra step has been missing. And of course, there's just kind of so much in Goffman, and there's kind of so much in these different areas of sociology, that it was maybe easier to kind of follow those lines.
So in the discussion itself, we'll put a link to the paper in the podcast description so everyone can go and read it for themselves. But in the discussion, it's what I quite enjoyed was, I suppose, some of the, I don't want to say sort of dramatizing, but in brackets, in some of the points, you're adding a certain tone of voice to the conversation. Sincerely, smugly, defensively, maybe
apologetically.
Sorry about that.
why did you want this to sort of be a quite kind of almost evocative conversation, not just a conversation that had, an abundance of information and argument in there?
I think in lots of ways I was kind of following Laurel Richardson's advice here to make your writing interesting, not make it boring, make it interesting so it engages readers. Because one of the issues as academics, obviously, is that we need to engage really with a wider social, which, for us in particular, it includes NGBs and it includes those who are responsible for coach education policy. So it was an effort at making research and writings, academic scholarship a bit more accessible, a bit more interesting, and therefore that they would read it. I think it was, from a selfish viewpoint, I quite enjoyed writing it because it was different, because it enabled me to maybe express myself a little bit more, like away from in a straitjacket, as I said earlier, of having an introduction review of literature, methodology, findings, discussion, which I find a bit restricting sometimes.
Has your position on that changed a little bit then? You're talking about adding these words in or these sort of tonalities in to make it a bit more accessible, etc. Because you talk sometimes about it being absolutely fine to make coaches or the people that are reading your work just work a bit harder to try and gain access to it themselves. So has your position changed there on how we get people to interact or engage with this kind of reading?
No, I think it's gone further actually, Mike. Well, if you look at the format here, without getting lost in the so-called kind of fetish of the form, it's not about the format. The format is the means, so the ends is the engagement. What I tried was to give opposite viewpoints. I guess in lots of ways, as happening now, as happening in everyday interaction. And the listener, or the reader, then is obliged to think about the viewpoints and to agree or disagree or maybe navigate a middle course. That's their job here. And so the reader is not thought of really as an empty vessel. I'm kind of inviting them in, like a lot more than, again, when you write, when you read a traditional article, in lots of ways that you don't have that opportunity to actually kind of think about, well, where do I stand or where do I sit in relation to really these arguments, even though it is not it is not like a neutral argument. It's not a neutral article here. There is weight on the side of educational relationship and apologetically, but still it's not all weighted that way. There is an acknowledgement of another way. And perhaps this is what we're lacking like a little bit at the moment, I think, within kind of scholarship, that I've said this before, that I think many academics, they don't read what's already been written. They have already made their minds up about what they want to say. And so, that's when you read introductions like of articles, you're thinking about, what about the work of X or Y, which has taken issue with this? Why isn't that a part of the introduction? So they better locate the study. I've tried to do that here to say that there is another way, whilst also inviting the reader in to actually make their own minds up about where they stand.
Why do you think that's the case then? Why do you think writers are maybe neglecting some of that historical work?
I think we could dedicate like another podcast to that. A culture of writing within universities, I think, in lots of ways, exercises like the REF, the Research Excellence kind of Framework, and the RAE, well, before that, are good things because they demand engagement with writing and research. I think that's a good thing. But it also, I think it also makes academics write for the sake of writing a little bit. And so So it's not what is written that really matters. It's just how much that you can write, and because you're held accountable for these things. So I think that there's something there that almost has hindered this idea of good scholarship.
So we've spoken a little bit about the format, some of the rationale behind it. Why don't we dip into what we've taken from the paper, the three of us, sort of having another read through, returning to the paper, maybe what kind of things that's bringing up in us. Do you want to kick off?
Yeah, and without wanting to, I guess, keep going down that avenue, but just what we mentioned previously, or I brought up previously, around how educational and sociological concepts can inform coaching. I think, Robyn, your point around then about scholars maybe looking at what has previously been suggested. You say quite explicitly here that neither do you believe that pedagogy or sociology have somehow got it right, and that coaching ought to unquestionably copy them. But I feel like there is an element of that in some of the research we see, that because we've had successful papers, we've had interesting papers that have used sociology or pedagogy, that the next thing is just to find a new sociologist or a new educational researcher who hasn't been applied in coaching, and just to simply embed that within coaching practice. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think so.
Why do you think that is? Is it simply not a case of people not looking at what's gone before, or is it out of
the quest for originality? Maybe they were constantly looking for the next thing.
Because originality is more than a new theorist, right? It's more than just applying a new foreign theorist, essentially.
I think there's elements of originality in that, but I do agree with you, Ollie, that just kind of finding a new social theorist, or just kind of finding an educational theorist and almost kind of shoehorning findings, into those writings is not the way forward. I think we've done enough of borrowing, really, kind of, from other areas. I think we should all learn from other areas, but perhaps what we should be doing, like, a little bit more, is to examine and discern and make decisions about what's unique about our own subject area and discipline, and whilst not ignoring what's gone, which is the earlier reading bit, so if there are some notions that have already been written about, included and examined, within the fields akin to kind of sociology, then we should use them, but not as kind of straitjackets, as maybe kind of sensitizing ideas and concepts that we should use to actually make even more sense of our own data, of our own field. And why do I lean so much on kind of sociology? I guess it's because I genuinely feel that our field is a social practice. It inherently involves more than one. Even though, I guess, at the end of the day, and you go home and you think about what you've done as a coach, and you rerun the video through your mind again or whatever, you're still thinking about the other, even though this is a bit of a lonely time for a coach. But you're still thinking about how you integrated, how you influenced, how you managed to get learning into others and the performance, etc., etc. So it's always aimed at the other, like even when you're alone. And so what really can help in that regard, maybe social psychology, largely kind of sociology, but not that itself. It's the essence of the subject that really, I guess, lent it more than a head start. Yeah, and then when we lean into education, then of course you're going to, well, actually, what am I trying to do here when I want this respect or when I want this influence and power? What am I trying to do? Because again, this is a means towards the learning of somebody else. Usually I'm talking about the grass work here, the kind of session work, the gym work, not everything else that kind of swirls around the job of being a coach, which is maybe speaking, I guess, with your assistants, maybe with secretaries and performance directors, which then invariably it goes into issues of influence, power, and trying to get your way and your agenda heard, like et cetera, et cetera. So that's why the leaning to kind of sociology, I think, was just very obvious for me.
You obviously mentioned before that you have some regrets maybe around not going to phenomenology at the start. Is that something that is needed now? Does either yourself or someone else need to?
I've had a few, but then again, I'm a Frank Sinatra fan. But yes, that is kind of some of the work that we're doing here at Cardiff Met. Some of the very, very enlightening work, actually. A student by the name of, excuse me, like Elliot Doyle. And yes, if I was to have all those years again, as I said, I ought to have done, I kind of should have done, and maybe started with kind of phenomenology. But when I started, it was pretty, wouldn't say I was just on my own, but largely was my own. And some of the stuff I started writing, it was acceptable for journals, and of course, just I guess realities of every day that you want to advance, you want your senior lectureship, you want to get your name out there. So there's those sorts of things. I think if I would have started with kind of phenomenology and the nuance and the work and that would have been much longer. Especially as a lone scholar. So I think those sorts of everyday issues really influence, which is quite interesting, and really when you look back on things about how the field perhaps kind of should have or might have developed.
How did you eventually find phenomenology then? Or how did phenomenology find you, as it were?
I knew about phenomenology as I knew about ethnomethodology. Reasonably early on. I knew about them and started reading a little bit, but it was, at the time, Mike, it was just so much easier in a way to actually kind of follow another, albeit a related road, i.e. through some micro-sociology interactions. And then about 10 years ago, actually, I started to really read about kind of phenomenology. Yes, I'm the phenomenon, again, asking myself the question, like as a coach, what am I trying to do here and what am I seeing? And led me into the work really like of Niklas Luhmann, which was a theory of observation. I was more interested there than than the network theory. And rather than following kind of phenomenology, I went after the observation because it was, I think one of the reasons was I'd already started writing about orchestration, coaching as orchestration. But of course, orchestration, there has to be something that feeds orchestration. I mean, what's the information source that then inspires you to orchestrate? It has to be an earlier step. And really, what do we do largely when we set up the session, when we start a session as coaches? We observe. And that's something that we don't kind of theorize enough. It certainly wasn't then, because it was all about kind of feedback, all about management. It was all about kind of setting things up, your progressions, blah, blah, blah. There was nothing about, the observation of what one is seeing in order that informs the feedback. So I found that really interesting. And again, phenomenology got relegated.
Was it a case then that, things like complexity theory, orchestration, etc., you had to follow those roads, and then it eventually got to a point where phenomenology or perhaps observation felt a bit more relevant because the work already done? Or do you think if you did go back to the start, you could immediately start with phenomenology, even pre some of those ideas?
That's what I should have done. Yes. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you reverse into the future, and but this is, I think, reading this article again, it gives more hints at the phenomenon, I think. Although it doesn't go there. It doesn't actually, I think it mentions it, but it doesn't go there explicitly. It's still about, theorists, Lafayette and Wegener are mentioned, Goffman Foucault is mentioned. Phenomenological writings, not really, although this is a hint at, well, what's the essence of the job here?
So one of the bits that I'm sort of quite taken by is during the discussion there's a subheading which is at the everyday level, and in that particular part of the conversation, just at the bottom of page 166, you start talking about perhaps the need to overcome or quash this idea of coaching being presented as boxes of certain activities, and then you follow the arrows and to subsequent completion of coaching is being done, etc. Getting over some of that structure. What I was quite taken by with that is, despite this recognition that coaching is complex, there's these sociologicals, the micropolitics, the pedagogy that needs to go with it, I still have lots of conversations nowadays about, what kind of framework do you follow for that? What kind of structure do you follow when you're doing that? Even yesterday morning, I had a coffee with a colleague, and we were talking about, the question was, what's the framework that you follow for your coach development work? And I kind of said, well, I don't really have a framework as such. So, that even 16, 17 years on from the paper, people still looking for structures, a bit of order, a bit of, perhaps, it's like a source of comfort for them a little bit. Why do you think we still have the existence of that?
You've answered your own question, therefore, and I've never argued against having structure. I think, if anyone says that, then they haven't adequately read the work. I've never argued against structure. I think it's the amount of structure and what kind of structure that one employs as a coach. What structure gives you? It gives you security, clarity. In this most uncertain of professions, this most ambiguous of professions, you undoubtedly need some structure. And that's what it gives you, I say. Even the arrows and the boxes, that I've felt, it just kind of hides much of the functional complexity of the job. It's in some ways it helps. I think it's the over reliance on it, and it's the, okay, well, this is how it is. Well, it's actually not how it is. It's this will give you something. But then it's the micro interactions, it's how you influence, again, with the learning of the others in mind. It's that's the bit that does the heavy lifting. And to think otherwise is you haven't experienced being a coach then.
Because I think, again, just thinking from my experiences of doing qualifications more recently, even CPD more recently, it's still, almost begins with structure. This is how a lesson starts. This is the next stage you take. This is the next step and you kind of have to follow. It's almost presented as you really should follow this procedure as often as you can, because it's, we've designed it and we've used lots of coaches to feed into this, etc. So it's sort of kind of presented as something that's a bit empirical. But then I never see the transition of those kind of structures into my own practice. It never seems to just work.
If I can rebound that question to you three, obviously much younger than myself, so experiencing it now, even though, when you have athletes in front of you, or when you have to go to speak to your assistants or your directors or whatever, why do you think that kind of structure in the way that you've described it now? Okay, not in the way that I have, but in the way that you have. Why do you think that is still so salient, important? And that's the first step when you think about, okay, this is how you coach.
For me, it's sort of the legitimacy that is placed in the educational realm for these coaches. It's the legitimacy of where just even the idea of structure comes from in the first place for coaches. They go to do a level 1, a level 2, even later levels, because it comes from a governing body, because it comes from coach educators, etc.
But why is it given so much importance? I'm not against having a level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. It's lots of ways like it's the same as having a degree program. We have level 4, level 5, level 6. First year, second, third year. But why? Content-wise, because structures, I guess, kind of frameworks, arrows and boxes. Why are they so? I guess kind of so lasting in their influence when we have an abundance of evidence to say, okay, I don't think you can do without them, but the essence of the job exists elsewhere.
I think lasting is part of it, because we've been doing it for so long. We've been coaching in this way for so long, and we don't think that is why the structures that you're talking about, we haven't actually stopped and think about the values. So I think something that that speaks almost on their behalf, or makes the argument for this type of structures, is that they've been done over and over and over again, and that's part of the influence that they have on how we do things today, I guess.
I think, particularly when dealing with, I guess, you mentioned like directors of sport or people above maybe coaches, kind of traditional hierarchy. I think there's an emphasis on safety or lack of risk associated with following a model that is evidence-based. And if you can claim as a coach, if you can claim or argue that you are following said model, then there's a lack of risk associated with the job that you are going to do. Whereas if you take them to a piece of research that is a bit more suggestive and context specific, that argues that yes, we might coach in this way in this context, I think it fills people with a sense of anxiety really about what's going to happen, because you're informing your practice by something that relies on a number of contextual factors. And as we know, we're all quite clear that we believe that's the best way to do it. But
so are we risk averse as coaches?
I think that first of all, maybe this is more about me than generalizing, but I think what we're looking for in a way is to look for control, which kind of speaks to what you're saying, Ollie, in terms of looking for some safety. But I think we look for control, we look for power, because we want to implement our own ideas in our context. So in a way, I would say, yes, that we are risk averse as we try to keep things controlled and contained.
But by implementing a particular framework, by implementing a model, we're abdicating our own power.
I think it's what's the kind of risk that I'm thinking about when I'm planning or delivering a session. There's safety. That's one form of risk. There's the result that follows.
Safety against what? Sorry, Mike.
Health and safety.
Okay.
Injuries, those sorts of things. There's the risk of the outcome. Following the training block or training session, the match on the Wednesday or the weekend, as it might be. That's a risk. But I probably spend more of my time in terms of risk, reward, benefit, however you want to word it, as what's the impression that that I give off? What's the impression that I leave my athletes with? Because for me, the risk is that I don't get invited back to carry on contributing to the field of coaching in that way. Sounds a bit self-indulgent. It's, it's certainly not intended to be that. It's just that I probably think a lot more with, okay, well, like the Goffmanian ideas and the Vygotskian ideas of presenting oneself in a way that people feel, my athletes, as it were, feel like they can place some trust in me to look after their development. That's more of the riskiness with me if I put a drill or an activity in place and it's terrible. I know I lose a bit of face with the athletes that I'm working with.
Think about the risk of them not learning anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The framing, I spend probably more time framing activities within a session than I do sort of demoing them probably and providing instructions, those sorts of things. For me, it's always the framing of things, which is important.
If we're really worried and concerned and anxious about athletes not learning or not moving and developing and progressing, surely we should be looking at the argument of ER within the paper. That this is what, as I said, this is what the heavy lifting of the job is. We should be concerned with that, not with implementing any kind of a model, not with implementing just exercises, and letting them go. Because we know who is the coach. We know that he or she is very important in the learning of others. Mm-hmm. And so they have to have this role. They have to be the more knowledgeable other, like in many ways, and it's how that's enacted. It's not a debate about the role as such. It's how that's enacted that really ought to be the concern. Okay, are they learning something here or not, as the case may be? And can you see it, which goes to the Lumanian thing. But it goes to something about the article. Why, even though that we admit we are concerned about the learning of others, what they're getting out of this session, the same with the students that, in the class. We're concerned with that. So why aren't we concerned with learning theory?
I think it kind of goes back to the original question. Why are we not seeing perhaps some of these ideas, or why is it the privileging more of structures and frameworks, models, etc.? I wonder how that sort of sometimes intimidating or inaccessible some of these ideas might feel to the individuals that are within governing bodies. We talk about governing bodies as a whole, but it's about individual people really, and whether they want to try and grasp these ideas that we're trying to get in. I think we're still fighting a battle, not with all sports, of course, but I still think we're fighting a bit of a battle of just gaining entry of some of these ideas into the courses, the CPDs that have that legitimacy that I think coaches are typically sort of leaning on.
So is this a battle with gatekeepers rather than ideas and knowledge?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a battle with coaches, as it were, even if it's people's early in their coaching careers, because I think that speaking to people, when you start having these conversations about their coaching and you start, I guess I've always found it get quite a nice response really when you start talking about, when I've spoke about the work that I've done obviously here, and people, it makes sense. It makes sense to people. I think it, like you say, there is some gatekeeping, if you like, in terms of coach ed or things like that, where it might get it, but I think there's a reluctance to really embrace it and to really think, okay, so we get that the educational relationship's important, but I think because the translation of that to, like you say, your level 1, level 2, level 3 is so difficult. I think it is, or so much harder to do that than it is to follow a model. So much harder than it is to deliver elements from more established and more linear fields in bits and pieces as kind of modules, if you like. You mentioned psychology for coaches. It's more difficult to deliver in a 2-day course how you navigate an education relationship than it is to say, here's an hour on psychology for coaches. Even something as you mentioned, that neuroscience is something that now is coming into coaching and elite sport. And whilst that is seemingly more inaccessible because of the type of work maybe that a neuroscientist does, there will be some outputs from that are more accessible than some of the complexities inherent with an educational relationship argument.
Isn't that part of the reason why you wrote the paper in this format? To make this dialogue accessible. And which I think it speaks a bit to the value of this paper today, is that it's not just about the message, but it's about making this message accessible and tangible for everyone.
Yes. There was an intention at accessibility here. But it's interesting. It just kind of following up on what Ollie was saying. Neuroscience says is if you try to explain that to coaches, that it would be a pretty difficult job in lots of ways. But there's still this kind of almost and pop neuroscience, if you like. It's not even like a simplified version of it. I think it's just a label attached to it that somehow makes science attractive. That there's a claim, an implicit claim towards hard evidence here. But again, it doesn't address somehow. It doesn't go close to the essence of the job of being a coach. And many NGVs, some are very, very good, but some still employ notions, from outside of coaching. And to a certain degree, that's okay, but only to a certain degree. Otherwise, you're educating about something else. Now, if you're not educating about the subject you should be educating about, then there has to be questions asked about it. Surely, it wouldn't happen in any other field.
Yeah, you're highlighting, I suppose, that fetish for hard evidence, because perhaps in neuroscience it can be a bit more numerical, perhaps, etc. But that's it's probably more of a privileging of a particular type of evidence, isn't it, rather than evidence nonetheless? Because that's not to say that in the coaching literature we don't have evidence, plenty of it, but it comes through means that aren't lab-based, randomized controlled trials, whatever it is that you think is the gold standard. It's from the lived experience of coaches out in the field. It's, it might come from interviews or some, ethnography and those sorts of things, reflective practice, etc. But still evidence nonetheless. And I think that's probably another battle that we're still fighting, isn't it? It's how do you promote the value or the legitimacy of that evidence that's coming out of some of the coaching research, against the typically sort of quantitative fields, maybe.
I think there's an element here as well that we shouldn't get mixed up in between. So practice is evidence-based, which really we shouldn't fall into being evidence-based. We should be evidence-informed, because we've done many, many studies in coaching, and we have results, we have kind of findings, but those findings are not automatically to be transplanted into other contexts. It does not work that way in coaching. So you can certainly use that evidence to inform your practice, to actually kind of think about it, but just saying, well, this worked for you, Mike, in your context, is not going to work for you, Manel, like in your context. Not automatically, not without thought and consideration, because everything has a history, a culture, is this kind of sociality, and this is where kind of sociology helps to actually make sense. It helps us make sense of context. So I just wanted to make that point.
And I think it goes to something that we're trying to write at the moment, Robyn, and I think it lends itself to what you said in the paper as well. You make the argument that we need to further research what coaches actually do while coaching, and if coaches are drawing upon neuroscience or drawing upon physiology or psychology, we need to consider those fields, but that's not from going directly to sports psychology literature or sports physiology literature, but it's really trying to understand how coaches are using those knowledge bases to inform their actual coaching practice and creating evidence and results that are a result of sports psychology being enacted by a coach rather than going directly to the fields themselves and developing that understanding.
We've spoken a little bit about, the three of us and kind of our experience, etc. Robyn, if you were to write the paper again for now, what would maybe be slightly different in the messaging or how you would approach the paper itself?
Well, as it happens, Mike, I did start writing, like a follow-up. Maybe about 18 months ago, I thought, this is probably deserves almost looking at where we are now in relation to what I wrote then, and in terms of the impact that the first article actually had. I'm not sure it will see the light of day, actually, but I did write a couple of thousand words down. Within the introduction, the names of the protagonists have actually altered. So CS, it's coaching science in the first one, has changed to SC, sports coaching. So we've dropped science. I think, and the science is rarely used. It's certainly used a lot less these days, I think. And then ER has become SPR, socio-pedagogic relationship. So they've altered their names as befits their slightly altered kind of status, and the field has changed. So they're arguing from slightly different viewpoints and vantage points now. So that was the first thing. And they go into this like a little bit. Oh, yes, I see that you've changed your name. Well, I see that you've changed yours too, haven't you? So it's not just me. So again, I wanted to give something of a dialogue here, that it wasn't just, okay, this is the right way and this is just some marginal voice on the outside, which echoes some of what Ollie was saying earlier, that we're not arguing against using any form of knowledge. It's just how knowledge is used within this thing called coaching. It does go into some of our discussion, actually. Okay, well, this seems good and seems good. Okay, how's your relationship with with NGBs? SC, sports coaching, asks this. SPR says, maybe not so good. It's better than it was, but really, 20 years on, I kind of hoped it would be better. And explores kind of some of this. And some of this, I think, is the fault of academics, that we don't really kind of think of ourselves as public-facing academics. I think we limit our thinking, our dialogue internally into our students. And that's the way that we naturally kind of affect society. But we should be thinking of ourselves more, especially these days, as outward-facing, and the role of universities within society and the value that we bring, and therefore the investment that we should have. I don't think we do that enough, or explicitly enough. So it's here, it's unfolding. It goes more into this thing about actually reversing into the future, and what we should have done a lot more is is kind of phenomenology. What's it like to be a coach? What's the experience of, not just through banal interviewing maybe, but really writing what the experience is like. Therefore, so using that as as leverage for teaching and education.
And so why is it you feel that might not see the light of day? Can we persuade you otherwise?
Or for a small fee, Mike, maybe. I probably, it might not. I've always wanted, not to be thought of as doing more of the same. And I was aware of, okay, well, is this really needed, or is it just because I'm able to? Is it really adding anything? And how provocative is it? Or is that the objective? Is just to be provocative? So without addressing that, I think, it's like a lot of my other writings, actually, it's a lot of them are just kind of stuck on the computer, and they haven't advanced, perhaps because other areas of, I guess, overtaken them, in terms of interest, in terms of kind of students who have dragged me into other areas. So again, it's this everyday existence, of to being an academic. You don't actually think about, like in 5 years I will have written X, Y, and Z. Even though we have associate deans of research, etc., who would really like this, it's very, very difficult to do that because of context. It's not that you shouldn't have a plan, an intention. You should, but it's very difficult to stick to that without influence, external influence.
Right. We normally wrap up a podcast by talking about myths we'd like to quash. I wonder if perhaps we should change that slightly for this week, and maybe ask Robyn, what are kind of the exciting things that you're looking forward to? In terms of kind of the distances already travelled. You've mentioned that we've got a journal, we've got crick, etc. What are the things that you're really looking forward to, and that you think are the kind of the beacons of hope, as it were, for the field?
Crick is really moving well. We have an excellent exec board. We have so many initiatives, and this is a plug for Crick. Obviously, just look up on the website to see exactly what's going on. We just employed like an ethical officer and a digital officer, and so things are moving there, I think, really well. Obviously happy with the way that the journal, SCR, is going. But it's always something, and I was just having a discussion with a few the other day. There's always kind of something of a discussion in between the expansion, i.e. to get more membership and more readership, without the dilution really of the message. But I want to emphasize that this is not really sort of ossifying something, and this is what we stand for, and that's it. I think the borders around it are leaky borders, but still, as really expressed in the article, I do think that one has to stand for something, and that's something over the years, as I said before, like it's grown. It's definitively grown, and you're the evidence here. You and others are the evidence here. And if you look at the journal, if you look at Crick, if you look at everything that's going on, and so that really heartens me. Really heartens me. I think the bits that we could do better as a field is to make sure there's no decontextualization any research that's written, make sure it's worthwhile. Make sure it's not just another set of interviews with coaches. It has to advance the field, or it can be it's a baby step, like a shuffle step or whatever. But make sure that the intent is there to advance the field and move sideways. And I think it's to make sure that there's interpretation, and they both are linked together here. Okay, within one's research, try to accept responsibility for that research. Because when you write something, it's there, and you've got to stand by it or not, as the case may be. And it's okay that you evolve away from it. I think it's okay. This is a state of evolution and development. But be, aware that, you write something, okay, well, this is representative of you and what you believe, who you are. There's not enough of that.
Brilliant. Anything from you two to wrap up?
Yeah, great place to end, I think.
Agree. On a positive note.
Absolutely. And you can hear Robyn's emails coming in thick and fast there. It's because they've all heard about this potential new article. They all want to read it. Really grateful to you, Robyn, for giving up more of your time for a second run. And, of course, Manuel for jumping into the pod with us as well this week. We will put a link, of course, to the paper in the podcast description. So really encourage everyone to go and give that a read. Many thanks again to Sport Broadcast team. Ellie's in the booth with us today. Thank you, Ellie. And of course to all of the other wonderful students and staff who've been helping us with our recordings. That is the end of season 5. No more for this season. But, and I'm looking longingly at Manuel, season 6 will actually be a bit of a run-up to the next CRIC conference in Norway. So we've got that to look forward to in the sort of the latter end of spring, start of summer before the conference in Norway. So we will be back. Until then, make sure that you subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your favourite podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media. All the relevant links are in the description.
And if you'd like to be featured in an upcoming listener special episode, drop us your questions to coachinghub@cardiffmet.ac.uk.